So to continue what we were talking about yesterday, where there's several alleles that could contribute to a trait, sometimes instead of several alleles, or in the case of the last example, 2 different genes, there are many genes. So there are some traits that you have that show polygenic inheritance, where poly means many. In other words, there are traits that are affected by many genes, not just 1 or 2. And hopefully you can see making a Punnett square for 6 genes would be rather cumbersome, and you won't be asked to do a calculation of a probability for something that's affected by many genes. But I still want you to know that this exists. Traits that are affected by many genes are typically called continuous traits. For example, height and skin color. If you think about height, there are lots of different possibilities for how tall somebody is. It's not that you're either super short or super tall. You could be anywhere probably from between 4 feet to 10 feet tall, and you could find humans that are that height. So things like height and skin color have many phenotypes. And I'm underlining the many because there are lots and lots of possibilities. Just like with height, how you could be short, a little bit taller, but still short, medium, taller medium, tall, really tall, super tall, extra tall. There are so many versions of height that people could be. The same is true for skin color. It's not like people either have skin that is white as the snow or skin that is as dark as the night. There are a million different shades of skin that exist. And that's because these 2 traits are controlled by several genes. So it's the interaction of a whole bunch of genes, which each have different alleles in them, that give you these traits. When more genes contribute, the ratio of phenotypes, so the ratio of who has what phenotype, ends up looking like a curve, kind of like this. I gave you the page number in your textbook if you want to look it up. They have like some specific data in there. But if this was the curve, along the y-axis would be the percent of people who have this particular phenotype, and along the bottom would be the phenotype. So if this was a curve representing height, we would have, our 10 feet tall people over here and our 3 feet tall people over here. And we would see that most people are in the middle, but there are people, because of the many genes that contribute, that have phenotypes that lean more to one side of the curve versus the other. If any of you are going to go to university and take stats, you will learn so much about a bell curve that you will maybe regret that you ever started learning about it. I thought I was done learning about bell curves, and then I went back to university, and I have to learn about them all over again. Now, no one will ask you in Bio30 to calculate anything off of a bell curve. That is not the point. The point of this is to recognize some traits have so many phenotypes because there are so many genes. If we were going to ask you a question about this on a test, it wouldn't be calculate the probability for the offspring. It would be something like, hey, how is it possible that there are so many different colors of skin for humans? And your answer would be, oh, it's a polygenic trait. There are lots of genes that contribute to this trait. Does anyone want to ask anything here? Okay. The other thing that I want to mention that can affect what an organism's phenotype looks like is the environment. We already know that there are things in the environment that can affect your DNA at the cellular level. Like you can have mutations in your DNA. So besides that, besides actual physical changes to your DNA sequence, there are still conditions that can affect whether or not your genes get expressed. And a really good example is temperature. Some genes will not be expressed, so transcription and translation will not happen for that gene if the temperature is too high or too low. For example, fur color. I don't know if you have ever noticed this, but in a lot of animals, like cats and dogs, there are parts of their body that tend to have a different color of fur than the rest. So I'm thinking like tips of the ears, paws, nose are typically places that you see that. Temperature isn't the only reason, but it certainly could be one. Parts of the body that tend to be a little bit colder most of the time will sometimes have a different color of fur because genes are expressed differently based on temperature. So that's just an example where sometimes you see different phenotypes in one organism because an environmental condition has affected the expression of their genes. If you think on the level of the whole organism, organisms like rabbits, let's say, whose fur changes color completely depending on the season, you could see how temperature would play a role in that. When it's warm, the fur is one color. When it's cold, the fur is a different color. So the rest of what we're talking about today is just a way of representing all of the stuff that we now know. What is a person's genotype? And we're representing it in terms of their family. Colloquially, you would call this a family tree. Scientifically, we call it a pedigree, but we are talking about the same thing. When we take a look at a pedigree, this is exactly what you have in your data booklet, which means you don't have to memorize it. I just want to explain what some of the symbols represent. So first of all, you have male and female. So simply by whether it's a square or circle, you immediately know if the person has two X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome, which is incredibly useful if you're talking about traits that are sex-linked. If there is any kind of mating, which sounds very primitive, but that means the organisms reproduced together, the word mating might not always be the word that you see. We might say we crossed them, people had a baby together, something like that. If there's one line, regular mating. If there are two lines, it means that they were close relatives. So typically in like regular family trees, this won't be depicted, but it's possible for you to have a question, because this happened, like this still happens in some places, where people marry their cousins or people who they are biologically related to in some way. Just so that you know, having offspring with someone to whom you are biologically related does not mean they're going to have Down syndrome. What it means is that there's a higher probability that if you both have a recessive trait, your offspring is going to have it as well. So all it means is greater risk of recessive traits showing up. There are Roman numerals. They're on the side. So an I for 1, 2 I's for 2, 3 I's for 3, IV for 4. They symbolize generations. Underneath each individual, there are Arabic numbers. Those are these ones. Yeah, regular numbers. Regular numbers are Arabic numbers. That's what they're called. They symbolize individuals. So if I wanted to refer to somebody on a family tree, let's say I wanted to talk about this person right here, I would say individual 2-3. So it's a way for us to identify who we are talking about specifically, first by saying their generation, so which line are they in, and then by saying which individual they are. And then notice this birth order. If I consider the 3 kids in generation 2, individual 2-1 would be the oldest child, 2-2 would be the second oldest, 2-3 would be the third oldest. So we always indicate birth order within each group. So, for example, if I consider my extended family, my mom comes from a massive family. There were 9 of them. There are 21 cousins, if I count them all. And if I were to draw my family tree, I can't overlap the lines to make all the cousins fit in the right order. So within each family, so within my family, where it was my parents, I would be first, then my brother, then my other brother, then my sister. Then in the next family, even though a bunch of them are the same age as us, we would just start with the oldest child in that family. So I wouldn't expect that the entire generation is in birth order, but each little family group should be in birth order. If there are twins, identical or non-identical, so remember identical is monozygotic, non-identical is dizygotic. The difference is instead of a vertical line, they're kind of diagonal. And if they're monozygotic, there's an extra line that connects them. The last two tell us whether they are affected. Affected simply means they have the studied trait. It makes it sound, I don't like the word affected, like they have a condition, like they have a disease. All it means is whichever trait you are investigating, they have it. So when you draw your family tree, some of the people in your family will be able to roll their tongue. They will be affected by that trait. So you color somebody's symbol in if they have the trait that you are studying. That's what affected means. If they don't have it, you don't color them in. So I'm going to show you some examples of what it would look like for different types of genes and alleles. We're going to consider 5 different scenarios where we compare what would it look like if the trait was autosomal, so not on a sex chromosome, and then what would it look like if it was on one of the sex chromosomes. Also, what would it look like if the trait was dominant versus recessive. So in this first tree, we're going to consider a trait that is autosomal and a trait that is dominant. 2 examples of autosomal dominant traits are polydactyly and Huntington's disease. Huntington's is a motor disorder. It involves your brain and your nervous system and your muscles. Does anybody know what polydactyly is? Extra finger or extra toe. So usually it's 6, like there's a 6th finger, 6th toe, but that's polydactyly. So I'm going to imagine that this is a family tree for polydactyly, because that's less sad than Huntington's. And I'm going to show you what it would look like. When the trait is dominant, we should see the trait show up in every generation. Now, does it have to show up in every generation? No, but it probably will. So what I'm going to give you are clues, things that you can look for that would be representative of this. So, because it's dominant, it should show up in every generation. That's not a different generation, that's a different grouping. Generations are the lines, the top line, the middle line, the bottom line. So like that's generation 1, that whole line is generation 2, and this whole line is generation 3. Another way of explaining this is that if offspring are affected, so are one of the parents. And that's at least one. Both parents could be affected. But what we're saying is there's no way a kid is getting it if one of their parents didn't also have the trait. Okay? The other thing that we should see, because it's autosomal, is that males and females should be affected approximately equally. Now, will this always happen? Certainly not. There are cases where things just don't follow probabilities, but probability would say if it's not on a sex chromosome, males and females should be at equal risk for whatever this trait is. So if I count 1, 2, 3, there were 3 females that I colored that were affected, and there were 1, 2 males. That's not perfectly equal, but that is close. That tells me there's no real skew towards one gender or the other. And so if I showed you this family tree, I would ask you, hey, what type of inheritance do you think that this is? And you would say, well, males and females are pretty much equal, so it's autosomal. And every time I see an affected person, one of their parents was affected. So I think that it's autosomal dominant. Would you be 100% certain? Probably not, but that would be your best guess because you used both of those clues to figure it out. Now we'll take a look, same family tree, but now we'll look at what would it look like if the trait was still autosomal, but it was recessive. So because it's autosomal, I should still see males and females approximately equally affected. But because it's recessive, I should see probably that it skips a generation. In other words, an affected person has unaffected parents. And this is a really important clue to look for because sometimes this is your proof. I have seen on diploma questions them ask not to calculate probabilities, but to explain how do you know that this trait is recessive, and this piece of evidence will be the reason. So for example, I'm going to illustrate that nobody in generation 1 was affected by this trait, but then one of their children was. And then I'll illustrate over here and over here. So in my example, males and females are both affected. When it's recessive, typically there are so few people that are affected that you don't have really big numbers. So even though there are 2 females and 1 male affected, which really is twice as many, 2 is not that much bigger than 1. So try to think about how many total people you had. If you were just thinking mathematically, that's twice as many. That sounds like a lot, but when it's 2 versus 1, it really isn't. So I have some males and some females who are affected, and it skipped generations. For example, look at this section here. Person 2-3 is affected, but neither one of their parents was. Over here, person 3-3 was affected, but neither one of their parents was. And person 3-6 was affected, but neither one of their parents was. I illustrated it a whole bunch of times here to really emphasize it. You might not see it in every scenario, but if you can find a spot on the family tree where the parents are unaffected, but one of the children is, that is almost certain evidence that it's recessive because it's skipped a generation. Now we'll consider some X-linked traits. We've talked about color blindness, so we know it's an X-linked recessive trait. When it's X-linked, we typically see more males than females affected. And when it's recessive, like before, it tends to skip a generation. In addition, when it's X-linked recessive, what we typically see is that mothers are carriers and pass on to their sons. So that means there will probably be a lot of heterozygous females who are passing the trait on to their sons. So I'm going to illustrate that this grandma here carries the allele for color blindness. I didn't color her in because she's not affected. She doesn't have it. But what typically happens with X-linked traits is that the female parent will carry the allele. She doesn't have it, but her male offspring end up being affected. They only get one X chromosome, and if they get her X chromosome that has the color blindness allele, they're going to be colorblind. So I know that this would be the genotype of my males. The little n is like the recessive allele for color blindness, where big N would be normal vision. So what you typically see is that mothers are carriers and they pass on to their sons. And that's why you tend to see more males affected than females. So this would be a very typical looking X-linked recessive thing. I have 2 males and 0 females. Even though 2 is not that much bigger than 0, there are none that are affected. That's pretty good evidence that it might be an X-linked trait if no females have it and only males do, even though the numbers are still small. Did you have a question? That's okay. We'll do the next one, which is X-linked dominant. X-linked dominant is different than X-linked recessive. When it is dominant, you expect it to show up in every generation. So like I explained before, if offspring have it, one of their parents has to have had it. Normally when things are X-linked, you would say that males are more affected than females, but not in this case. Because it's dominant, even if a female has 2 X chromosomes, she only needs 1 copy of the dominant trait to have it. So we would expect males and females to probably be equally affected by this. So, how would you tell the difference between X-linked dominant and just autosomal dominant? It would be tough because you would be looking for the same type of clues. In X-linked dominant, then I'll draw this guy is affected. If he is affected, all of his daughters should be affected. Why? I'm going to give him this hypophosphatemia. Hypophosphatemia, vitamin D resistant rickets, affects bones, makes people have bow-legged legs. If a male is affected, all of his daughters will be, because he is definitely giving his daughters his X chromosome. So even though males and females might equally be affected, look for fathers passing on to daughters. If you can see that, that might help you distinguish between regular dominant and X-linked dominant. So I'm going to draw him and then his daughter being affected, but his sons not being affected. So I know that his daughter would certainly have one copy. Since grandma is not affected over here, and it was a dominant trait, I know that she has 2 copies of whatever the recessive allele is. So her daughter has to have one of each. Now if I look at the next generation, the mother could pass the trait on to her sons or to her daughters. So I'm going to color in a son and a daughter to illustrate that. So fathers should only pass it on to their daughters, but mothers pass on to both. So because mothers can pass it on to sons and daughters, it's harder to distinguish that. I find that looking for a father who has only passed it to his daughter to be the most distinguishing thing to look for. Last example, Y-linked. There are not that many Y-linked traits because the Y chromosome is so small. An example would be Y chromosome infertility. Y-linked is usually pretty easy to identify because every male in a biological line is affected. And not just some of them, it can't skip every single one of them. Why? You get your Y chromosome from your father. If your father was affected and you are male, you will be affected too. So in this family, grandpa's going to have it, which means both of his sons will be affected. And if they have any sons, their sons will be affected. Notice how I did not make this person affected. Person 2-2 was not his biological son. That's his daughter's husband. He's not part of the biological line, so he's not included in this every person in the line. So if it's someone that we've added in through marriage or through a cross, they don't have to be affected. But if I can draw a continuous line, right? Everyone in the continuous biological line who is male will be affected. Does anyone want to ask anything about that one? I invented a Y-linked trait in the aliens in one of your problems. They had hairy noses. So this is what should happen. Every single male offspring of that male extraterrestrial should have the hairy snout.